Now let's go ahead and get into the 5 things you need to know for March 18th, 2022. Number 1, focusing on headlines. So this is season pass sale season, and there's been a couple announcements for the Indy Pass, the Mountain Collective, and the Icon Pass. Vail Resorts and the Epic Pass has not made any announcements yet about next season in relation to their season passes. But what we do know is that the Icon Pass is raising prices for next season, anywhere between $40 and $80 per pass, depending on the type of pass. They have added 3 new destinations, most notably Sun Valley and Snow Basin. The Mountain Collective has actually had a little bit of a shakeup where Sun Valley and Snow Basin have also joined there, but they've also are restricting Altera resorts from being on any of these third-party passes. So looks like your access to Altera mountains will be only on the Icon Pass. And then also there's the Indy Pass, which has was launched, I don't know, a few years back, and it provides just a couple days of skiing at independent resorts. And you can see some of their text here. They're really going after the mega passes. So in fact, they've actually offered a Indy Switch Pass this year. So if you're actually switching from an Icon or Epic Pass or even Mountain Collective, you get a special deal if you provide your receipt from last year. Kind of feeding off of some of the crowded resorts, long lines, etc. So we will see how that goes and wait to see what happens with Vail Resorts and the Epic Pass when they announce that. There hasn't been anything coming out from Vail Resorts as to when we can expect it, but you have to assume it'd be any time now. Tom is going to take us through some other of the headlines that represents our number 1. So on to Tom.
All right. Thank you, Katie. Appreciate it. And continuation number 1, standout headlines, and most of you probably saw this week that Vail Resorts is going to invest $175 million in pay increases in housing and HR, and that is very much, I think, in direct response to what was a bunch of our headlines last month. And all the press that was going on around these issues with staffing and lines and so forth. So it is actually, they're not the first to raise wages, but it is the biggest one. And so it does actually make a splash because of the visibility of Vail Resorts. The $20 an hour starting wage, a lot of career development going on, which is an investment in the future, and it gives sort of a long opportunity look for employees. Housing, they're looking to build and lease. That obviously has a very long tail on it. And an investment in some 60, I think, really human resource staff to help take care of some of the issues that are happening internally or that were reported to be happening internally with staff there. So that's pretty significant from an operational point of view for Vail Resorts. It's obviously a clear response that there were issues that they acknowledge and some changes that had to take place. I think they're all good. I'm particularly interested in the housing and how that goes over the course of the next, I would say, 12 to 48 months. We all know that housing issues aren't going to be resolved overnight, but it's good to see the commitment and the investment to that. Next standout headline really came out yesterday, with the Canadian federal government announcing an end to pre-arrival COVID testing for travelers entering Canada. This has been a huge barrier for Canadians coming down to the United States because of their need to get a test to get back across the border. It's been very easy for us as people who are either permanent residents or citizens here in the United States to get tested for free. But when Canadians come down, they don't get that benefit. And if they're coming down and have to get back across the border, it's $150 or so a person to get back up into home, and even then they may end up having to quarantine. So the lifting of this restriction really opens things up nicely. It'll apply to all land and air crossings. It's going to change things dramatically, even here in my neighborhood where I'm very close to the border with Vancouver. The positive, our biggest international market is freely open. or at least almost completely freely open. It's a big win for the Northeast and border resorts, who do rely a lot on Canadian visitation. The negative is not really much of a negative. Americans are now freer to go north, although it wasn't all that difficult to begin with, but the positive far outweighs the negative. And so I think this is an opportunity, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with marketing efforts and sort of calls to action to our guests from north of the border. Next up is economic trends. There's a lot of language on here that's probably not worth reading in detail or going over, but this is a good takeaway slide to have. And it really has to do with gasoline prices and mountain destination travel. It's a question that does come up fairly frequently. And there are a couple of scenarios out there, and one is that increases in gasoline and fuel prices last 6 months, and they end up causing behavioral blips. As gas goes up, diesel goes up, and jet fuel goes up, and the consumer economy in general gets more expensive because the cost of getting things to market becomes more expensive, and so that makes discretionary dollars have to be fought for by consumers. You got to think about whether they're going to, how much they're going to keep the lights on versus how much they're going to travel. It does push up natural gas and heating costs, and those end up, of course, translating to keeping the lights on at a lodge or at a condominium and keeping the units warm. And how are you going to do that? And that gets passed along. But that also is true in food and beverage. The cost of putting steaks on the grill at a restaurant becomes more expensive, and so that all ends up getting passed down to the consumer. So the possible consequence is shorter distances, perhaps, for travel. The last 2 years, we've seen drive market extend from about 500 miles to about 750 miles during COVID. But that might compress considerably if gasoline stays really high. Might shorten stays, or there might be less expensive travel destinations people look for. But the long term, which is probably the more likely scenario, can actually change market behaviors. And this is the one that we actually think about more when you're thinking about the long term for the destination, because it includes everything up above. But it also, you have to think about employers and increasing wages over and above what already needs to happen in response to the staffing issues. But you need to remain attractive to prospects, and employees may not like to do jobs that have a commute because of the cost of getting to and from work. So if you're in a mountain town and you're sourcing your staff from a satellite community, that could put pressure on it, and that's not resolvable until housing issues get resolved. But people remember the last time we've seen really record gas prices that might be sustained was some of us might remember the 1970s, although I was pretty young at the time. But there was a huge move to smaller, more fuel-efficient cars, and nowadays, consumers would move towards smaller and EV options. In Canada, there's huge investment going on at the provincial level in electric vehicles. The question is, do we have the infrastructure in our destinations to handle that sort of thing? Consumers are making greener choices. Is towel and bedding in frequency and LED lighting enough for consumers that are trying to go greener? And international travel can change. So this can have actually an interesting consequence in the long term. Your staffing overhead goes up, energy costs go up, and so you end up with higher room rates but a lower margin. And there's a keeping up with the Joneses, those communities or properties or counties or even countries that anticipate large societal changes around things like higher fuel costs and move towards electrical grid issues and so forth. They're the ones that are going to have the edge. And what's the opportunity cost of inaction? So I said I didn't need to go through it all, but I did. But it's interesting to watch and to see what happens. We don't expect that gas prices are going to go much down towards where they were for quite some time, if they ever even do. And when I say where they were, we're talking about pre-war and the changes in how the world is dealing with Russian and Ukrainian resources. So moving on to number 3, Dustimetrics, and taking a look quickly at the data for winter versus all 3 of the last 3 years versus 2021, 1920, and 1819. And it is green across the board in all cases. Occupancy is up 33% versus last year, 35% for rate and 78% for revenue. And versus 2 years ago, the occupancy gains are smaller. That's more of a flattening, but the rate and revenue numbers continue to be really strong. And so what is notable probably is that there are some changes from where this was last month. So where you see a red arrow here, that number is down from where it was last month. in the comparison, though it is still very strong and on the positive side. And mostly what we're seeing is this sort of change in occupancy, where the growth in occupancy is slowing down a little bit. But the growth in rate continues apace. Look at that a little bit more in a few minutes. On the trend side, real estate is cooling where cooling is relative. Markets are hot, and that's just the way it is. But housing issues are going to be front and center for a long time. In the meantime, 14 of 19 destinations are seeing increases in available housing inventory for sale on market and lowering of prices. And that goes to the issue of the real estate boom that we've seen over the course of the last 18 months that has contributed largely to workforce and available rental, short-term leisure rental housing. And so some softening and some plateauing is good, though they still remain in record territory in most destinations. There are a few, particularly around the Tahoe region, where things are still bolting upwards pretty sharply, and we'll look to see how long that sustains. In the meantime, that's all good news. And then on our wild card, it really is, I hate to say it, but Omicron BA2 is a wild card. Cases are going up globally in COVID-19. It's driven by the original Alpha Omicron in Asia and BA2 in Europe. The slides on the right-hand side of this show you caseloads going back to December 28th or so, and following through the January surge, and now we start to see this uptick going on. We do know that infections in Europe are a leading indicator for North America, so we can expect some impact here. That's proven itself out over the course of the pandemic. We do also know that BA2 is 30% more infectious, and so case and hospitalizations are likely to surge. And the problem, one of the problems over and above the obvious ones, is that this might combine with these new economic pressures to really slow down short-term bookings, which is a pattern that we have seen reliably as well over the course of the pandemic. The positive side, current vaccines apparently are as effective against this as they were against the original Omicron. 66% of Americans and 82% of Canadians, who should now be considered as part of this equation, are fully vaccinated, and warmer weather always helps. Gets people outdoors and allows us to continue to gather and do those things in our destinations.